Welcome to the Elevate Podcast, a space for the whole church staff to learn together, grow together, and elevate their ministry tools and calling as they engage the whole church with the whole gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm your host, Darrel Girardier, and I serve as the communications director here at Brentwood Baptist Church. And with me today is our senior pastor, Jay Strother. Jay?
Darrel.
Hey, glad that you're here on the podcast.
Here we go, episode 1.
This is it. This is
pilot
the inaugural
program.
This is it. It's all downhill from here. I'm just kidding. Thank you all for joining us for today's episode. Jay, I want to kind of dive in a little about who we are as a church.
Sure.
Because I think for a lot of people tuning in, they may have watched us online. They may have seen Travis lead worship, you preach, maybe watch our Christmas concert, but they really don't know who we are.
Yeah.
So if you were just telling somebody like, here's who we are as a church, kind of give a little overview of Brentwood Baptist, its history, model, kind of give us an overview of who we are.
Yeah, Brentwood Baptist was started as a community church, as a church plant itself, out of Woodmont Baptist Church in West End area of Nashville, back in the late 1960s. What was interesting was some experts at the time said, I don't know that I'd start a church in Brentwood because I don't know that it will ever be big enough to support its own church. But they were convicted, and lo and behold, those convictions have paid off over the years. So we were launched actually in the basement of the Tennessee Baptist Children's Home, which is kind of a cool connection. We still have a passion for foster and adoption ministry to this day. And then we bought a piece of property on 409 Franklin Road, just a few miles from our current location. And Brentwood grew into a thriving suburban community church. One of the things I'm blessed to have been on staff here for 24 years now. So I've been able to build relationships with some of those charter members. And I loved the attitude that they kind of brought with them that's still in our DNA to this day. One was kind of this gospel first and always. We're going to be solidly committed to the gospel and the word of God. But we're going to engage the community, and specifically that meant young families. So they did some radical things, like in the early 70s when they decided to build a building. Instead of building a worship center first, which is what all the churches were doing at the time, they decided to build a gymnasium. Why? So that they could roller skate, have basketball leagues, and then they would set up the chairs for church. And even a mark of service in the early years was you got to be a part of what was called the Fellowship of the Chairs, that you got to stack and set out chairs. And that's what the men and the young men of the church did. And so there was this ethos that was, hey, we'll kind of do whatever it takes to reach this growing community with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so another interesting facet of the church is that I'm only the third senior pastor in its 54-year history. And so you had a real stable leadership model for a long time, which can't kind of be overestimated. And we'll talk a lot about leadership on this podcast as we go, because so much of ministry is cultivating and developing leaders who can carry out the vision of the church. But Mike Glenn came in the early 90s to succeed Bill Wilson, who was our first pastor. And Mike brought a real dynamic teaching style. The church began to grow really quickly at that point. The community began to grow. The south suburbs here of Nashville became some of the fastest growing communities in the whole country. Everybody loves Nashville, big city amenities, small city feel. And so families, good place to raise a family. You get all 4 seasons, but it's not usually extreme one way or the other. Low cost of living, all of those things, good schools. So this area just boomed. Again, that vision that God put in the hearts of the founding members was really beginning to pay off. And so in 2002, we moved to a new campus right off of Interstate 65. Matter of fact, right next to one of the exit ramps. And Mike will tell you that God put us there for a reason. Of course, we wanted to gather people so they could hear the gospel. We wanted to be able to disciple and equip people. But also that exit ramp was symbolic that our future was going to be running members off, as he liked to joke. As you know, Baptist churches are infamous for running church members off for negative reasons, but we know the Great Commission tells us to go. And that means we go to our region, we go to our cross cultures, means we go to our nation, we go to our world. So we really begin to see this as a launching pad for what God could do. And it was interesting, the faster we grew and the more members we ran off to ministry and missions, the more God continued to give the increase.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I remember you telling me you remember being on staff here,
Yeah.
and you could all fit around like a table.
That's right.
And then in a blink of an eye, if you will, almost,
Yeah.
it's like you've said, like all of a sudden, it's like now we fill up like a small worship center.
That's
with
right.
The entire staff.
Yeah. Well, my predecessor, Mike, will tell you, he pastored kind of 5 different congregations in the same location, which I think is interesting when we're thinking about Elevate and how to elevate your game. You know, we have been a small church plant that became a good sized community church, that became a mega church, that became a multi-site church, and now really is a regional kind of national, church that networks in all different kinds of ways. And so we've had to adapt and grow and learn with the community and with those changing demographics. And so, when I first came, our first staff retreat back in fall of 2001, that's when I came on staff. I think there were 15 of us, meeting around a table. It was just such a different day. But, as we grew, we knew that God had positioned us in a unique place. I tell people all the time, I pastor a great church. And by that, I don't mean our facilities, which are wonderful. I don't even mean our programs or strategies, which are good. But I mean, God has given us an amazing group of people. And so when you figure out what God's put in your body and you're able to channel that and pull out those gifts and use them, you begin to discover, ministry gets creative and fun. And so that's even really how our campus strategy developed. Of course, all our own story is woven into it. When we moved here in 2001 and I took the student minister position, we couldn't, quite frankly, afford a house at that time in the Brentwood zip code. And so we bought a house in a growing community about 30 minutes south. It's called Spring Hill. And Spring Hill had 3,500 people within the city limits at the time. Now we're about 15, 16 years later from then, from when we launched our first campus out there. And now that community has about 70,000 people in it. So again, God can see things we can't see. And, and so for me and my wife, we were driving up here to the church. We loved our church and our community. But my wife, who just has always done a great job keeping ministry real, she invites over neighbors for meals and started a ladies' Bible study in our home, began to recognize that because Spring Hill was growing, people were moving there from all over the country. Nobody had a church home. Well, come with us to Brentwood. Well, it's far. It's a 30-minute commute. It's big because we were growing rapidly during those days, and it's in a little bit of a different community, a little bit of a different socioeconomic bracket than we're used to. And so that began, to get our wheels really turning. Well, what does it mean to not just ask people to come to church with us, but to bring church to them? And so at the same time we were growing, adding 600-700 members a year after we added this moved to this campus, we began saying, we're going to have some strategies that are bigger than just a single building will hold. And the multi-site model was coming into focus during that time. And so we put together a research and development team to kind of look at the different churches and how they were doing it, video venues and, church mergers and, drive times and all of these kind of factors. And so there were what I would call several streams that came together that led to our multi-site strategy. One was our building couldn't hold all of the people that we needed it to hold anymore. Number 2, you do begin to get a model in which it's just easy for people to come and be spectators instead of participants when you reach a certain size. So how do you mobilize people back into their own community? And so what we really kind of landed on is more what I would call a hybrid approach to multi-site. The theologians and the strategy experts, they'll call our model a federation approach if you want to be technical about it. But it's where all of our campuses share the same mission and vision. We share a unified governance and budget, but we give our campuses some freedom to contextualize what we do as Brentwood Baptist Church into the neighborhood or community that we're in. And so for us at the time, that meant starting our first campus in the Spring Hill, Thompson Station communities, which run together in that part of town. And so we creatively called our first campus the church at Station Hill. Thompson Station, Spring Hill put it together. It's about as creative as I get, Darrel. Yeah. We leave that to you guys in the communications team.
I get it. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, because I remember that whole process. I was on church staff, being an outsider looking into that process.
Yeah.
When you were beginning that process, was there? I mean, you're looking at all these different models. You're trying to weigh all the options out. Was there any sense from you that going, hey, you know what? It'd be easier just a church plant. Did that ever cross your mind?
It's interesting, sure, because you're evaluating all of the things. And as a church, you need to know, we don't just embrace one model. We don't think all churches should be multi-site. Matter of fact, we support a lot of traditional church plants and church revitalizations or church renewals. But I would say for us at the time, there were were several factors, and here are the things we've discovered. One is there were a group of people, my family included, in our community who loved the DNA, which I spoke to a moment ago, of Brentwood Baptist Church. We love the gospel first and always. We love the focus on families and outreach into the community. We love the missions legacy and the impact and the focus there. And so we loved our church. But again, we had these barriers. One of them was geographic, drive time. One of them was socioeconomic, a little bit. There's these different barriers. And so what we discovered was those barriers go away when you say, hey, we're going to bring our church to you. It in a healthy way, I think it helped us reimagine some things and helped us to remember who the essence of who we were. And so it was challenging at times, but I will tell you this, as a pastor, the gift for me of being a campus pastor instead of, having all the heavy lift of doing a church plant on my own was, NASA has a formula. They call it max Q. It's the amount of thrust that it takes to get the space shuttle off the ground and into orbit. And I would argue that any church plant has to have a certain max Q to really be launched in a healthy way. So for me, I got to focus on preaching God's word, taking the message, that same message Mike was preaching, by the way. We would choose a text and we would plan together our sermons, but I was able to make it fit the community that I was in. So I got to focus on that, pastoral care, nurturing, developing leaders at that campus. What I didn't have to stress about was the offering going to be enough to cover our bills every week? If I wanted to implement a new program or something, I could say, well, we don't do that at this campus yet, but our Brentwood campus does. So you can go plug into that. And over time, as our campus grew, we were able to adapt those ministries and strategies to our own campus. So we had a jumping off place from, and I had what you would call air cover. It's important as a pastor to know that you have support, that you're not kind of out there on a limb with every decision you make. COVID in particular, that season revealed that it was a healthy part of our model. We weren't single pastors trying to, in our own context, solve all those problems that COVID created. Instead, we were able to pray and think together as a team and move together as a team. And so there's a lot of pros and cons, I think, of any model. But for us, this model, kind of the federation model of multi-site, made a lot of sense. And it proved successful, in the sense that we started with 100 adults, about 50 families, and we found that's a pretty good size launch team, by the way, for us, just as a rule of thumb. Now, we had 75 kids. So from day one, we had to figure out how to do preschool and children's ministry because of a growing young community.
Yeah, by the way, it was a small space. I remember I walked in the space. It's not a big space.
Yeah, but by God's grace, we met in a school initially. Then we were able to lease a space that was connected to a weekday preschool that we were able to rent. So we had to get creative, but that was just what the founding members of this church did. So when you're convinced that you need to get the gospel to your neighbors, what I loved about our launch team was they were this plucky, hardworking group of people who were convinced, I love my church, I love God, I want to connect my neighbors and people in our community to that experience. So we'll give up the large facility, we'll give up some of these, things that we had developed at this campus over time in order to make that a reality. And they found out, wow, God can do this. And so we began to grow 15, 20%. It wasn't explosive growth, but consistent, healthy growth that got us to the point where it was the leadership of this church, not even me, who said, hey, we need to go find land. And we were able to purchase 30 acres debt-free. So that's another benefit. We weren't ever carrying a yoke of debt and a building payment because, again, all of the church got behind that vision and said, even if that's not happening at this campus, we want to be a part of what God's doing in that community.
Yeah, I think in some ways, observing from the outside in, at that time, a church member, not a staff member, it felt like we had almost figured out a way to do church planning, but in a slow, methodical way. It's kind of like when you're cooking. You got a microwave, you can, heat it up, it's fine. But the food's better when it's slow cooked.
Yeah, good point.
And that the church, our model was like, hey, we're going to do this, but you don't have, as you said, all those pressures on you. Because the average church planner, they may get a 2-year runway of cash, maybe, from volunteers.
It's tough.
And they've got to figure out, they got the building, they got to figure out staffing models, all the other details. Yeah. And then you really hope it takes off. And so one of the things I've admired from the outside now as a staff member is seeing the fact that we've taken that pressure off of them so they can really figure out how to best contextualize ministry in their context. That being said, how have you balanced context versus continuity? And when you talk about ministry at a context level, for a local level, what does that look like?
Yeah, it definitely ebbs and flows. And so I used a little insider term that I used to call the dance, right? Doing what I needed to do to lead my congregation to the next place God had us to go, also while honoring the DNA, the systems of our church. And so I think the best way to describe it, Darrel, is to think like a missionary. A missionary takes the things that are unchanging, the gospel, the word of God, biblical principles, but then it adapts them. A good missionary gets inside the culture, lives with it, and adapts those unchanging truths to the culture that they're a part of. And so really, church multiplication at any level, at its core, that's what it does. And as I mentioned, I think it even had a healthy effect on our Brentwood campus as well, because all of a sudden ministry leaders had to think, oh, wait, how does that work at this campus? How does it work at another campus? And then in 2014, we made a huge leap. We launched a campus and we merged with 2 churches. So all of a sudden we went from 2 campuses to 5.
In 45 days. I want to add, we did that in 45 days.
Yeah, somebody was on the communications team. You remember well.
I remember doing 3 campuses in 45 days.
And I think that was the turning point too, in the sense of, okay, it was, what are we doing at Brentwood? How does that work at Station Hill? Now all of a sudden it was, whoa, how does this work in a number of different contexts? So what it forces you to do is go back to your fundamentals. You think about successful athletic teams, and you marvel sometimes at how well they play. But underneath it all is they can't get away from the fundamentals. If you're a football player, you got to block and tackle well. Right. If you're a basketball player, you got to be able to dribble and shoot. A baseball player has to hit for average, has to be able to field, we call it 5-tool players. Being a former coach myself, that the game is built on those fundamentals. And a lot of churches at some point, they get to the point, and here's what I would say, they fall in love with their method more than they do the mission. They've left the mission behind for the methodology that has worked at one particular place because they have one set of circumstances. They have a big building, they have a budget, they have these things. Now all of a sudden you have to recreate that in a new community, and it's challenging. So I think it helped all of us to kind of rethink, what really mattered. And again, the imperative of the Great Commission is to make disciples. So how are we making disciples in these contexts in which God placed us? And we had to really rethink that sometimes. But I would say, the way we did it, one of the things that I was convicted about, and this came from our senior pastor too, and our leadership, we didn't want to sacrifice the spiritual health of our people to advance the mission. We felt like we could do both of those things simultaneously, but like you said, you can't move as fast as you have to move deliberately. So let me give you a quick illustration. I had a church consulting friend call me about a year after we had planted Station Hill as our first campus, started Station Hill, and he said, hey bro, are you doing okay? And I said, yeah, it's busy, life's full, like we're figuring out stuff, but it's exciting. And he goes, well, I just wanted to check in because man, it's tough on guys who plant because you've probably lost about 50% of your launch families after the first year. And I looked at my little picture I had of our launch team, when we took a photo at our commitment service, and I was like, actually, we've not lost any of them. And he said, you're kidding me. And again, the model meant that those families, we weren't burning them out. We weren't, because that's what usually happens in that scenario, including the pastor can get burned out. So we were able to launch, I think, with the help and support of the larger congregation in a healthy way. And that made a huge difference for us. So there's always a dance, I think. There's pros and cons again between, how much is centralized, how much you're allowed to contextualize. And different organizations, different churches have a different bandwidth to be able to deal with that. One of the things that I remind people, if you want to go real inside baseball, everybody thinks about Nashville and they think, man, it's country music and the entertainment industry. And that's what gets the headlines. But underneath it all, the largest industry here is healthcare. And so our church is made up of healthcare executives who deal with massively complex organizational issues every day. And so for our church, the idea of having this kind of a model in which just like you have a chain of hospitals and you have to figure out, how do I make sure that my hospital meets the needs of that local community, wherever that hospital is, but yet we're networked together. So there's specializations and these kind of things that take place. Well, our people are used to that kind of level of conversation. So it didn't intimidate them. They kind of got it at the beginning. And again, it goes back to what I said. Look at what God's put in your congregation and figure out how you make that work to advance the mission mission. So love the mission, but only like your method, because your method's going to change. And our methods have certainly changed and continue, by the way, to adapt and change over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that the healthcare, because we have about 700 to 800 healthcare companies here in Nashville, and so that definitely is infused into our DNA.
Yeah.
But one of the things I tell people when we interview people to join the team is I say, look, I said, you're going to be a little bit struck that we're a very stable organization, a stable church, and what I mean by that is like, look, we love our senior pastor. I'm not saying that just because he's on the podcast, but I said, Jay can't fire you. And they're like, what? I was like, yeah, I know. A lot of churches, that's the model. New pastor comes in, sweeps. So we don't work that way. We have processes in place. And we do that. One of the reasons why we do that is we believe by creating the most stable environment possible for you, you can minister in the best way possible. And that to me is one of the things I love about us as a church that I can tell creative when they come on board. You can dream, you can do these things, and you don't have to worry about if you misfire, it's going to be okay. We're going to make it through this. But it's not a place where we just do these rapid changes. Now, at the same time, you and I have experienced it. We've had people who wish we would move faster, wish we would do those things. And, why can't we do X, Y, and Z? But I think it has served us well in the long run.
Yeah, my predecessor said if he ever wrote a book on church organization, the way we do it, it would be called Running with the Tortoise. Yeah. Slow and deliberate, so slow and steady wins the race. A lot of people are surprised to find out that we're one of the largest, if not the largest, church by membership in the Nashville area. And some of that's deliberate, just because we've tried to be faithful and consistent over the years. And so models come and models go. We'll kind of sit back and say, oh, what works in our system, what doesn't? And again, not to pat ourselves on the back, but that's just, again, a part of our DNA, a part of who we are as a church. And, I used to teach that new member class, because when you start a campus, you kind of do everything. And it was always funny because I'd put up the org chart and people's eyes would just kind of glaze over. But then when you describe, there's checks and balances. You just watch everybody relax a little bit and say, okay, that's what I wanted to hear. That's what I want to see. That if something goes haywire or off the rails, as Proverbs says, wise is the man who seeks many counsels. And our system has a lot of counsels that, before we take a step, before we make a decision, there's a lot of godly people who are praying into and thinking about that decision.
So let's transition into you becoming senior pastor.
Sure.
So about a year ago, actually, you came on board.
Over a year ago.
Yeah, a little over a year. We're celebrating almost 1 year as you as senior pastor. You've actually spent some time doing a little traveling. You actually spent some time down in Brazil and the Ukraine, and you kind of came away with a running theme that I found fascinating. Walk us through what you saw, what you observed as you kind of went across the globe and saw what the global church is doing.
Yeah. For over 20 years, pretty focused on what God's doing here. Always mission partnerships and church multiplication partnerships. But you become senior pastor, and all of a sudden you're invited to do different things. And so tried to pray through which opportunities I wanted to be a part of. And so, I had the opportunity to travel to Brazil to speak at a global leaders gathering for a church network there, about 5,000 pastors. I definitely felt like the odd man out. Man, they go after it. So exciting to see what God's doing in the global South. The fervor, the evangelism, the passion of those pastors was just exhilarating. And then through one of our own mission partners who runs a nonprofit focused on the former Soviet Union and equipping and training pastors, planting churches there, had the chance to go to Ukraine. And so very different experience, as you can imagine, but also very, very fascinating and encouraging to see the resiliency of their faith. You forget that the older leaders in that part of the world, they were the underground church under the Soviet Union. So I tell people they have a muscle memory we don't have in the West of how to do the church, how to be the church under persecution. And so just a fascinating experience. But you sit back as pastor and you try to process, okay, God, what am I seeing? And so both through our work regionally, through some of our friends and even some of our own people that we've sent out nationally, and then through these international journeys, I began to see this thread, and I really think it coalesced for me is that churches that are committed to the Great Commission, they're making disciples, they're multiplying, they're doing missions in their community and committed to do it throughout the world. What's happening is they are organically finding one another in what I would call natural relational networks. Sometimes these happen through kind of the traditional denominational connections, but more often than not, it's not about that anymore. If you read the headlines, you'll know a lot of our denominations, a lot of our traditional institutions have just, for whatever reason, a myriad of reasons, gotten bogged down in various controversies and issues and challenges, and that's what happens over time. So there's a lot of churches on the front lines that say, hey, we appreciate our heritage and our denomination and these kind of things, but man, we see God at work through you guys. Will you talk to us about that? You guys are doing this. How is that working? And then, hey, there's some things that we could share with you, and so that's exciting to me to see that the Holy Spirit's just kind of working around all of the things that we think should stop the church. There's this narrative that the church is in decline and the church is struggling, and I think that's true in some places, and it's true especially of some of these traditional institutions. But churches that are committed to the gospel, man, there's a movement that's taking place that's kind of underneath all of that, and there's really a groundswell. Most of these churches, they can't launch campuses fast enough. They can't plant churches quick enough. They can't find enough space for their existing campuses and church. So God's doing something, and we simply want to be a part of that. So that really led to, as I took over as senior pastor, I realized we were 7 years into our 5-year vision statement, but that was an okay thing. My predecessor, Mike, he was very wisely. He wasn't going to launch us into kind of another chapter of our vision, knowing that God was calling him to his next assignment to train and equip pastors, and was going to call me in as senior pastor. So we adopted a new 5-year vision statement that says, in response to God's leading, and in much prayer. So again, we don't do these things apart from God. We do nothing apart from him. But we know that we are called to fuel. I like that word fuel, right? It means resource, invest in. It's a broad term, but I like it. We're called to fuel a disciple-making church multiplication movement. And really, you could say movements. You could almost make it plural because we want to be led where the Holy Spirit leads us, right? And those movements should, properly done, link us to ministries that are sharing the gospel with millions, that are meeting community needs by the thousands, and that are helping us to continue to build what we call a network of 100 healthy churches, which is really building on the vision that our previous senior pastor had.
So how do you as a leader manage that when you've got this vision and you're sitting there thinking, you're seeing this organic network being built, and yet, you're coming back to Brentwood Baptist and you're saying, here's what I'm seeing. But we have we're 50 years old. We're a church that's 50 plus years old.
Yeah.
And we've got this built model. It reminds me of the book, The Cardinal Way, where you've got, I think you got one side, you got Jockety. Is that on one side?
Man, you playing to my strengths here. As a lifelong St. Louis Cardinals fan, yes. Walt Jockety was the general manager.
And so he's the guy who's the traditionalist, I guess. And then you got Lunhow over here. And so he's the analytics guy. And then you got somebody, you've got Mosley. He's the guy who's got to bring them all together.
Yeah.
So are you thinking okay, how are you managing infusing a new vision? And then you've got probably some traditionalists are thinking, wait, are we going to lose this over here? How do you manage that as a leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So The Cardinal Way is the book about how the St. Louis Cardinals developed, even though they're a smaller market, less resources than, say, the Yankees or the Dodgers, how they developed a system. Yeah. And I think for us, if there was a Brentwood way, it would be some of the things that we spoke about. There's a dogged commitment to the gospel and to scripture, to disciple making. So you put those big rocks in the jar first. And then the question becomes, well, how are you going to do these things? And so again, it's loving that mission, but recognizing that the methods may change. And that's what baseball and other sports have been going through, right? Is the challenge of, the traditional baseball scout would look at a guy and say, I like the looks of him. He looks like a baseball player. Well, now you have these analytics guys, who are looking at everything, the launch angle of their bat, the velocity that they run with, all these advanced metrics. So how do you marry those two things? And I think, you go back to what Jesus says in the New Testament about, that you don't put new wine in old wineskins. And so when God's doing new things, you're always looking for what are the new structures and forms. 30 years ago, hardly any church was talking about multi-site. Now, I think if I read correctly, I think it's 78% of mega churches are multi-site because that's a new wineskin. Again, I think at the end of the day, church history, if Jesus tarries, right, we'll look back on multi-site as simply a healthier form of church multiplication. It's not the only form, but it's a healthier form of church multiplication. And by the way, another little inside thing you can learn from us after all these years. Some of our campuses have taken off like a rocket. Others, it's been more of a journey to get them aligned and to get them going. We've discovered this, and we've discovered this the hard way. What you need for a healthy campus is a group of people in a community who have our DNA as a church. A shepherd who loves them and loves our church and gets how to contextualize it to the community. You've got to have an under churched, or what I would really call under gospeled, right? That's what I like to say about Nashville. There's a quote church on every corner, but there's not a healthy church on every corner. So you have what I'd call under gospeled communities. And then number 4, you just need a space. When we've discovered that can be a church that's not being used anymore. It can be a storefront. It can be an indoor soccer facility. But those 4 elements are really the key to being in campus. And by the way, if those 4 aren't present, then we find another way. We don't need to make that a campus because our DNA isn't there. We don't have a shepherd who's of our leadership pipeline who understands us and how to contextualize that. So I think that those are all pieces of that. So like our cardinal way, right, would be we've discovered this is the way for us to advance healthy campuses. And if not, we have other lanes by which we support church multiplication.
Yeah, I think you hit on something really important there, which is the idea that like we had to think through those 4 different components you just listed out in terms of before we actually go into an area and say this is going to be a place where we actually do a campus. We just didn't randomly just pick those places. I think the funny thing is to me is I think 2 of the hardest parts is we've got the people, and I think people who are church planners, people planning campuses would come back and say space is actually, in an area like this, space is actually one of the more difficult things for us to find and get. I mean, we've got visions of like going to the Smyrna area, and right now it's kind of like, well, what are we gonna do? It's like we've got an elementary school and we've got to find a vacant warehouse. Like those are really our current options as it currently sits.
Yeah, and that's a part of the journey that every campus has to go through. So I would still argue some of those multiplication elements are there, dependence on God. Right. As the guy who started our first campus, I hit my head against the wall in a growing young community trying to figure out where we could gather, especially that had a space for 75 kids. So we could talk for days about the stories, but eventually you engage your people into praying and God will show you a solution that only God could really show you. An example of that recently is our Avenue South campus. Well, we only had one campus that didn't have a permanent church home, and it's in the urban core of Nashville. And everybody told us it had already grown to 350, 400 people. People are like, you cannot find a space at a reasonable price for a church like that. And so we knocked on doors, we enlisted real estate agents, we did all of our due diligence. But finally, we found a church that had moved to another part of the community, and they were holding on to their building, not wanting to sell it to a developer, and they could have for millions more than they sold it to us because they said, even though we're not going to be here anymore, we still want there to be a gospel presence in this community. So we had to wait on the Lord a little bit for that answer to be revealed, but I want to encourage you that God has a solution, and it's usually bigger and better than the one you would have dreamed. And I've walked that out myself at our Station Hill campus, and I thought there was one place we were going for sure. That got swept out from underneath us. We had to get creative and use a school and use a dentist's office and use a weekday preschool. But then God blessed us with 30 acres, by the way, less than a mile from a $3 billion General Motors electric battery plant that has just been constructed. Again, God way ahead of us on the game there.
Yeah. Going back to what you were saying about the organic networks and how you've seen them kind of just begin to develop. Your heartbeat has been, I've noticed, to fuel that movement. What does fueling that movement look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot of different ways and angles it takes on, but I'll tell you this, and I hope you're hearing this as a theme. Yeah. Like all healthy things in the kingdom, it's rooted in relationship, right? Ultimately, even the gospel story itself is that we're disconnected from God because of sin. God made a way through Christ for us to be reconciled, for that relationship to be restored. So I would argue all healthy things in the kingdom are as a result of relationship. And so really fueling is we make a connection with someone who's like-minded for the sake of the gospel, share similar doctrinal identity, similar missional passion, and we say, man, what can we learn from each other? How do we support each other in that way? And so, I think one of the things that I recognize, Darrel, I was raised in the Midwest, not far from where your wife grew up. Yeah. We've been friends since high school. And so, one of the things that I recognized moving to Middle Tennessee and here is that God has blessed us with a tremendous amount of resources, in particular the people, even more than financial or buildings or anything else. And so it's selfish to try to hoard that, and so if God's shown us something, to the degree that's good stewardship, we want to give that away. We want to be open-handed. We want to share. I have to fight that perception a little bit sometimes because of our size now. People come to us and say, oh, you're just wanting to, take us over, or you just want to, and it's like, no, we just want to help. We recognize that no single church, no matter how many big or how many campuses you have, can do it all ourselves. It requires gospel partnership. It requires us to work together. You think of Paul in Philippians chapter 1, who talks about the fact that every time I pray for you, right, I pray for you, man, just with thanksgiving and encouragement. Why? Because he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it in the day of Christ Jesus. And we simply want to walk with like-minded churches in order to see that kind of gospel partnership fulfilled.
Yeah, I think you hit on the head when you were talking about, some people assume that for some reason, we want to take you over, and like the reality of it is no, we just have resources that we want to share.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's unique about us and why I'm excited that we are creating resources is that, for those of you who don't know, all of our campuses, they vary in size. We have one campus that runs about 120 to 150 on a Sunday, up to this campus, which runs a couple of thousand. So we've got varying sizes and varying contexts.
That's right.
I like to tell people, we've got a lot of minivans down at our South location. If you go up to our East Nashville location, people walk to church with coffee in their hand, and that's completely different vibes, different contexts. I always say it's one of the challenges of my role is that we just don't just take and turn around, create everything like a Target where everything is red and white and looks exactly the same, like a Target store. Everything has got a different context. And so it allows us to have not just a wide array of resources, but experiences to share with people of like how we do ministry in different contexts, which is one of the reasons why we've created the Elevate Conference, which let's talk through that just for a brief second here. We created a conference that's coming up in September. Kind of give Jay a little bit of like, how is this the next natural step in those organic network relationships that we want to build?
I think there's a couple of streams that come together in the river for us. One is, out of these natural relationships, we naturally like to go to other churches and learn from them. We get a lot of calls from people saying, hey, can we come, learn from you guys? And we love to do that. But at some point, there's so many of those calls that come, you think, well, wouldn't it be fun if we just all get together and share those ideas? So, we've all been to conferences before where you go and you hear what they're promoting or the book that they're selling or the program that they're kind of pushing out. And I get it. We all understand that model. And I've been to lots of those conferences, and I learned a long time ago, if you can take one thing away from every conference or seminar, then it's been worth it, So I try to pull out that one thing. But what we really envision, again, as part of a network is relationships. So what if we got these like-minded churches together? We did it one day, kept it as simple as we can. We do some things to inspire and encourage each other. Sure, we share what we're doing. Again, God has enabled us to have some really incredible ministries. I think of Embrace, our special needs ministry right now. Matter of fact, right now, there's a group from another church who's touring our facility, learning about that ministry. Foster and adoption ministry, what we do in Next Gen, on and on we could go. But we want to share those things. But one of the things we want to make unique about this conference is we want it to be a dialogue as well. So we're going to have our team share, here's what we do. Now tell us what you do. And tell us what's working, and just good things happen. I think of Psalm 133:1, right? When people dwell together in harmony. And so when we get God's people together, thinking about these things, we're able to share what God's teaching us, but we want to learn what God's teaching others as well. And we think that can serve, I like the word catalyst, right? It's a word from kind of the chemistry world that you insert an ingredient and all of a sudden it's catalytic. It makes movement take place. And so, we want to be a catalyst agent for what God's doing. And we think that by bringing together and providing some space and resources, we can help fuel this movement.
Yeah, and one of the things you and I talked about when we were on the team, just kind of planning and dreaming this was, we want to be a catalyst. We want to bring people together. But one of the other pain points we saw was that you've been to conferences for senior pastors. Yep. I've been to communications, marketing, media conferences, and those are great. But the reality of it is the majority of people at our church are wearing multiple hats.
That's right.
You may be over communications, but you're also over missions. You may be missions and groups, connections. Yeah. In fact, we've got ministers who wear multiple hats.
Yeah.
And to get training, to get equipped, you'd have to go to multiple conferences.
Yes.
So what if you could just bring your whole staff and in one single day get all the training and people can bounce around? That's
right.
Which I think, again, is unique as somebody who's my background is doing this type of events. That's something that's really hard to do in terms of like to get all that training and all the equipping that you need. So our hope and our prayer is that you can bring your whole staff for a day, hang out, pop into different things, given whatever your role may be. Or maybe find something new that you haven't thought about exploring ministry-wise. Because we're going to be talking about foster and adoption care, special needs ministry, things that may not be in your wheelhouse, but you've thought, wow, what if we could do that? Well, you're going to hang out with us. We're going to talk about those things. So hopefully you'll be able to join us and check that out.
And I think a little secret that I learned too, when I took a team to a conference, the content was good because it got us out of the day-to-day of ministry to think strategically, but the gift was around the dinner table that night as you just spent 2 or 3 hours unpacking and sharing and, learning, having a shared experience together as a team. Really, that time was more valuable. So I would encourage you guys, man, make dinner reservations that night, maybe plan to a half day, in a hotel conference room the next morning to process that together as a team so that when you go back, you say, hey, here's some things we learned, but you're moving together. Because we've all gone to a conference and one team member gets real excited about this new thing and everybody's else like, great, we were here changing diapers and making the next bulletin and it's just hard. So this gives you a chance to move in sync together as a team.
Yeah, I agree. I think that to me, what I like going to conferences is the best parts of the hallway conversations.
Yeah,
it's not the breakouts.
And the relationship building.
Exactly. Bumping into people you haven't met, you haven't seen in a long time, or meeting new people. So thanks for tuning into this episode of the Elevate podcast. I'd love for you to join us this September for the Elevate Conference here at Brentwood Baptist Church in Nashville, Tennessee. It's a one-day event crafted to encourage and equip your entire team with breakouts, inspiring keynotes, and networking with church leaders from around the country. Register now at elevatechurchconference.com. You can find the link for registration here in the show notes. Next week, join us as Travis Cottrell, the Travis Cottrell, our worship minister, explores worship in the church. A can't miss episode for worship leaders and their teams. Check out the show notes for registration links and resources. And we'll see you this September at the Elevate Conference.